Pearl Harbor, of course, is in December of '41, and almost immediately people start talking about what's to be done with the enemy alien population, which includes German and Japanese and Italian foreign nationals who are enemy aliens. And there's an internment program that starts with them. What happens to Japanese Americans is a little different, and it's commonly called internment, but actually most historians now talk about it as removal and incarceration. So the Japanese American population in general on the West Coast, which 2/3 of the population were American citizens. So they were not enemy aliens, they were American citizens by birth. They were rounded up en masse, and they had to leave their homes if they lived in what was called the Western Defense Zone. So they were removed, they were forced to leave, and then they were put in camps surrounded by barbed wire in the interior, and they were not charged with anything in particular. I got interested in this issue when I read an article about African American and Jewish civil rights organizations, an article by Cheryl Greenberg, talking about how the issue had passed unnoticed to them. And they were in New York City, right? The headquarters were. So I got curious about what the reaction would be here. And I expected to find that the Jewish community, because of the involvement in civil rights issues, would have spoken out here. Because unlike the Jewish community in New York, for those who lived here, Japanese Americans weren't an abstraction. They were their neighbors. They were familiar with them. And the community had a commitment, a public commitment, to speaking out against what they called prejudice in all its forms. A lot of the reaction was really a non-reaction, and I think in order to understand the significance of it, you have to understand something about the context. So the first thing to understand is that as the policy started to take shape, and it took shape in February and March of 1942, by the spring, Japanese Americans living in the area were rounded up and put in temporary camps near the large cities, and then they were subsequently moved to the camps in the Intermountain States. In general, West Coast non-Japanese Americans, the population in general, most politicians, most newspapers, strongly supported the removal of Japanese Americans. It was a very popular policy locally. So that's one piece of the context. The other piece of the context, and what got me interested in this question really, was that the civil rights organizations, which were largely based back east, didn't pay much attention to it. What I found was that for the most part, there was very, very little said about this. And so I started by looking at newspapers, the community newspapers, and each of those major cities had one. And there was almost nothing said. But when you started to read between the lines, there were these awkward almost mentions of Japanese Americans. So right after the executive order, Roosevelt's executive order that kind of launched this policy, in all of the major Jewish newspapers on the West Coast, they were weeklies, and they had editorials talking about how the rights of all have to be protected and we should fight prejudice in all of its forms and so on and so forth, without ever saying the word Japanese specifically. So it was almost as if they wanted to say something, but were nervous about actually doing so. So there was, I call it a kind of awkward silence or an uncomfortable silence around this issue that I started to investigate more. To speak out about it was to stick your neck out, and the Jewish populations were already nervous about anti-Semitism. So that's one piece of it. The other piece of it that I think is interesting is if you look at these newspapers, what you see is that these communities had really two main agenda items at this moment in time. One of them was this agenda of fighting prejudice in all of its forms, because they believed that only when all prejudice was eliminated would anti-Semitism be eliminated, that you had to fight it together. The other priority was to support the war effort in order to save European Jewry. And so this policy, I think, really put those two goals right into conflict with one another. So the War Department and the president himself was saying that Japanese Americans had to be removed in order to further the war effort, that they were a threat to the war effort. So you would think the inclination would be that the Jewish community would support that. On the other hand, those few people who speak out against this policy say that it's a policy based on racial identity, right? And so if you're against prejudice, you should be speaking out against it. And so I think that this policy brought those two goals right into direct conflict with each other, and that's what produces this kind of silence around the issue. Some of those who, it depended a little bit on the community, but some of those who spoke out were threatened in various ways. Yeah, there was very strong feeling, and you have to remember that at this time there were blackouts in the coastal cities. There was a fear on the West Coast that the West Coast would be attacked, and so tensions were quite high. The community relations committees were an arm of the Jewish community that emphasized what was at the time called intergroup relations. So work with other ethnic and racial minority groups against prejudice in all of its forms. And so I knew that the group in LA had emerged during World War II as a force in the community, and it's often held up. There are several accounts that hold it up as one of the major organizations behind civil rights activities in Los Angeles. So I went to their archive expecting that they would be a group that spoke up. And what I found was really quite different than that, and it goes back to their history. So they were founded under a different name. They were called the Jewish Community Committee of Los Angeles. They were founded in 1934 at a time when anti-Semitism was increasing very rapidly in the Los Angeles area and Southern California in general. And so they made it their mission to document that anti-Semitic activity, some of which was coming in the form of pro-Nazi groups. There was a group called the Silver Shirts, for example, and there were various Bundist pro-German groups. And so they wanted to document what was going on. One of the people who came to work for that organization, a man by the name of Joseph Roos, was originally from Austria. And he and his wife and several other Austrian and German Jewish immigrants actually went out and infiltrated these meetings of these pro-Nazi groups, and they would take notes. They had code names. They would take notes on what was going on, and then they wanted to get the word out. And the message that they wanted to get out was that these groups were both anti-American and anti-Semitic. However, they felt that if it was a Jewish group getting the word out, that would be perceived as self-serving. And so they wanted to find a way to get the word out in a more neutral way. And so the solution that they found was in 1939, they started an organization called the News Research Service, which you'll notice doesn't say Jewish in the name. And the News Research Service published a weekly called the Newsletter. And it went to important decision makers. So they sent it to the press, to all of the major newspapers across the country, to many members of Congress, to the president himself, to people in the Justice Department, and so on. And it began to have a reputation as a very good source of news about these kinds of fascist groups. When Japan joined Germany and Italy in the Triple Alliance, then the group started publishing things about Imperial Japan as well. And in the end, they published several pieces in the late 1930s and 39 mostly about Japanese Americans. Now, clearly they were not going to, they were not passing in the same way that they passed among the Austrians, but they were clearly getting the information from somewhere else. And a lot of the things that they circulated have been long circulated by the many anti-Japanese forces. There was a lot of anti-Japanese tension in the West and had been for some time. So they spread the off-cited report that Japanese American textbooks that were used in the after-school programs cultivated loyalty toward the emperor and were anti-democratic, that kind of thing. Then once Pearl Harbor happened, those reports got picked up even further. And so the News Research Service information that they had gathered ended up being used in various government reports. So for example, the House Un-American Affairs Committee, the earlier version of that, it was chaired by Congressman Dies, Martin Dies. It was called the Dies Committee. And there was a lot of contact between the Dies Committee and this group, the News Research Service, which is part of the LAJCC. And their information goes into some of the testimony that helps justify the removal of Japanese Americans. So yeah, it was a rather unexpected finding. And both at the time and in the years since, There was knowledge that the News Research Service supplied part of the information, but it was not known that that was a Jewish organization until I found this information in the archives, much to my surprise. It's very odd to read that organization's materials because at the same time that this is going on, they're expending a huge amount of effort working on these anti-prejudice campaigns. I think what happened was that it is very useful for them to have these contacts in the government, in the Dies Committee and so on. And the Dies Committee, they were aware, had some issues with excess, because it was not only going after fascists, but also after communists. But it got the word out so effectively about the dangers of Nazism, and that was really their primary concern. The vast majority of their materials was really about fascism and primarily about pro-German groups. And the Japanese American stuff was not great in volume and was sort of incidental. It was secondary. It was something that they did because the Dies Committee and others asked them for information, and they got the information, as I said, from elsewhere, and it kind of funneled through them. However, it did end up having an impact. So there was a report put out by the Dies Committee about the dangers of the Japanese American community. It had a more formal name, but it became known as the Dies Yellow Paper. A lot of that information comes straight out of the News Research Service. And so they ended up doing a lot of damage, yeah. Even during the war, this coalition of pro-civil rights groups comes together, and one of the things that they do is try to work to enable Japanese Americans to come back to their homes. And that work starts as early as 43, 44, trying to get the government to distinguish between those people for whom there might be an individual suspicion as opposed to the community in general, and to allow them to come home. And this group is involved in that work. And there's no indication that anyone that they don't acknowledge it. Though there are histories written of this group, this is never mentioned. There was an interview done years ago. He's of course since passed, but there was an interview done years ago with Joseph Roos, an oral history. And when they get to this part of the history of the organization, he asked them to turn the tape recorder off. And so I wasn't ever able to hear what his comments were on it. But they do work very hard to support the Japanese American community afterwards. And so one has to think that they realized that they had done wrong in this case. I mean, these are people who spent, including Joseph Roos, these are people who spent their lives working on civil rights issues, and that they participated in this is really shocking. People have a difficult time hearing it. There were certainly Jewish Americans who stood up, just as there were other Americans who stood up and opposed these policies. They were in the minority. Certainly in the West Coast, they were very much in the minority. But people don't expect to hear this story. And unfortunately, it's a story of kind of getting in bed with the wrong people. So they got in bed, so to speak, with people like Martin Dies and so on, because he was able to further their campaign against anti-Semitism. But in doing so, they ended up doing damage to another. I think that many people read history looking for good guys and bad guys. And here's a case where, if you look at, to go back to this organization in Los Angeles, and like I said, these are people who dedicated their lives to civil rights. And yet even they got caught up in this, in a sort of wartime hysteria and expediency and so on. And so it's not so simple as just good guys and bad guys. And I think, you know, as we saw at the time of 9/11, I think, during times of war when people feel vulnerable, they sometimes aren't as thoughtful about things as they might be. And so I would hope that that would be the message. I'm certainly not trying to vilify the community. Certainly if you look at the Jewish community overall, the fact that they maintained a silence for the most part, an official silence, at first when I started doing the research, I saw that as a failing because I had expected them to speak out. But when you look at the secular press at that time, I mean, people are virtually screaming from the rooftops that all of the Japanese American community should be taken away. By not jumping on that bandwagon, right, that says something. So I kind of shifted from seeing it as a failure to seeing it as, you know, they realized, right, they weren't going to get on that bandwagon. So it's not quite what I expected to find, and it's often not the lesson that people expect to hear, especially, you know, when I go out to talk to community groups. People will come to the book or come to my lecture expecting they're going to hear the story of the good people who stood up. And there's some of that in the book, but it's a much more mixed bag.